Yeah, good afternoon, Eric. Thanks for inviting me. I would love to be there today. Eric didn't mention, but I'm a South Georgia boy. I was born in a military hospital at Fort Dix, New Jersey, but I was raised in Douglas, Georgia in Coffee County, and my family still lives there. So it would be nice to come home, but I had to teach class this morning. So here I am virtually giving a presentation. So I'm going to talk about the effects of fire on wildlife foods, but first I want to acknowledge the major players that contributed to our team effort. The work I'll present today was conducted entirely on Fort Liberty, previously known as Fort Bragg, and we had two really important contacts there, Jeff Jones and Alan Schultz. And those folks helped us design our research, implement the research, and certainly they helped transfer the funding. Chris DePerno was a PI on the projects, and there were many other state and federal agency biologists and academicians that helped with the project. Overall, our work at Fort Liberty was done by 12 graduate students, and I hear via text that Tony Kroger's in the audience there. Tony was one of those 12 graduate students. I'll be presenting only a small portion of the work we've done on Fort Liberty. There were also 4 postdocs. We've published more than 43 journal articles. And of course, the field work couldn't have happened without the efforts of many field technicians, undergraduate interns, and some volunteers. So most importantly about what I'm going to discuss today, I want to highlight the roles of Drs. Marcus Lashley and Coulter Chitwood. They really led the majority of this work. Marcus is now a professor at University of Florida, and Coulter is a professor at Oklahoma State University. And these the outcomes of the projects I'll talk about today are largely their ideas. So the work occurred at Fort Liberty, which is in the Sandhills region of North Carolina. And you can see from this map, Fort Liberty lies at the northern distribution of the longleaf pine ecosystem. The Sandhills is managed intensively for the longleaf pine community and the plants and animals associated with it. Fort Liberty is a really cool place. It's about different numbers. I see different numbers, but I'm going to say it's 160,000 acres in total. Here is a smaller portion of the base on which we worked. The big sort of yellow areas here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, those are impact areas where the military fires ordnances. Many times those ordnances are unexploded, so we don't go in there. So that area is not included in the research I'm going to talk about. But the remainder of the base is managed for access, for military training, and also for conservation of the longleaf pine community. And Fort Liberty is pretty cool because it has this incredible network of east-west running training roads that also act as fire breaks. And you can see those on the map. Those east-west roads or fire breaks are also bisected by mostly north-south drainages. The drainages you can't see so much here, but also drop zones. So the gray areas are military drop zones where the paratroopers drop out as part of their training. So it creates a real sort of cool place to implement fire and also study fire. The main goal on these colored sort of fire burn units here is to burn every 3 years, primarily in the early growing season. When burn quotas are not met, though, the burn crews will burn in the dormant season. So we have both early growing season and dormant season burns that occur on the base. The ultimate result of the frequent fire are uplands that are dominated by longleaf pine woodlands, with wiregrass as being the prominent ground cover. The base, the primary role of the base is to provide access for military training, but it also focuses on conservation of high conservation priority species, including federally listed species like the red-cockaded woodpecker. Here you see tiger salamander, Bachman sparrow, and southeastern fox squirrel. But what I'm going to talk today is less about those conservation priority species and more about huntable species and how prescribed burning affects the food and cover for those species. I'll focus mostly on food because that's the title of my talk, but I'll briefly mention cover. And I'll start by talking about the availability of white-tailed deer forage quantity. So how much food is available and how is it affected by prescribed burning? So we measured forage quantity using 4-foot by 4-foot wire cages. And the goal of these cages was to exclude deer to prevent deer herbivory from affecting the outcomes of our study of fire effects on forage. I will note that deer herbivory is really a low risk on Fort Liberty because deer densities are mostly low, ranging from 10 deer per square mile to maybe upwards of 40 deer per square mile in some areas. This is Marcus with a grin. Sorry for the graphic photo here. We used a cool approach to identify the plants that deer eat on Fort Liberty. This is called a histological analysis. So we collected deer droppings, and then we sent the droppings to a lab where they are investigated microscopically. So that they're cross sections that are viewed in microscopes, and they're able to see cell structure and identify the plant species that are in deer droppings. And then those plant species represent the foods and plants that deer actually eat. So we could analyze the total biomass of forage in response to fire treatments and also the biomass of selected forages. So here's the first graph of results. I don't know how to get rid of that. But, so this is a graph of the total amount of deer forage available 2 to 3 years since fire. And so I'll try to describe all these graphs as I go. And so on the y-axis is the biomass of forage, and on the x-axis are 4 land cover types on Fort Liberty. Bottomland hardwood is BH. Dormant season is upland longleaf pine dormant season burn units. Growing season is early growing season upland longleaf pine burn units. And then we have upland hardwood. So there are some small upland hardwood inclusions here and there on the base. And you can see that overall the total forage biomass was fairly similar among these 4 land cover types. You see that wiregrass in orange dominates the upland types, both pine and upland hardwood systems. But the one take-home message here is that of the green, which are the selected forages, there were slightly greater biomass in the dormant season burn units on Liberty. Sorry, I may say Bragg a few times. But I think what we were more interested in is looking at the forage availability in the upland pine systems that were burned with early growing season fire, because that's really the goal. That's the primary management goal on the installation, is to use early growing season fire to manage these upland pine systems. So here again we have forage biomass on the y-axis, and in this case on the x-axis we have years since fire in these upland growing season pine units. And you can see a pretty obvious trend in that the biomass of deer forage, this is selected deer forage, declined with time since fire. A little uptick in 3 years since fire, but overall it was a declining trend. I have unburned drainages on here just as a reference. So those unburned drainages are more static. Fires do back into the drainages, but they tend to have a more sort of stable forage biomass. I will suggest that the forage that's in these unburned drainages, though selected, is not as high quality as what you might see in the recently burned units. So time since fire, it has a negative relationship with the availability of selected deer forage. But we conducted this was part of Marcus's dissertation. We conducted a concurrent study to look at deer space use, and specifically we looked at adult female use of burn units. And we saw that through telemetry data, these adult female deer avoided recently burned units. And that was odd to us. Why would they avoid recently burned units when we knew that those areas had the most quality forage? So what we did was we actually used a camera study to maybe get at the causal factor for that avoidance. And we put cameras in the same treatment units where we monitored forage availability. So time since fire units in the upland pines. So here you can see an adult female deer with a fawn. And what we did was we measured a ratio of vigilance to feeding. And so when a deer is vigilant, it has its head up. And so here you see the adult deer has her head up. And in this case, she's vigilant and keeping an eye out for predator. And we knew through other work that coyotes depredated both adult and neonate deer at a pretty high rate for neonates on Fort Liberty. So if the deer is actually comfortable, they will put their head down and they would be in a feeding position then. So head down is feeding, head up is vigilant. So when we graph the amount of time spent feeding, which is a comfortable situation, versus the time spent vigilant on the y-axis, Across the different years since fire treatment, we see that soon after fire, the deer are more vigilant and they spend less time feeding. And as the time since fire increases, deer are more comfortable foraging and they're less vigilant. And this even goes into the unburned drainages that are quite dense. So what happens is the vegetation in the understory becomes denser with time since fire. Deer become more comfortable. So the story is here that cover also matters. It's not all about food, and that deer, especially when they're heavily depredated by a predator, have to balance risk of predation with the availability of food and where it is. So next thing we did was we looked at white-tailed deer forage quality in relation to fire. And so Marcus and Coulter went out and collected plant parts in different fire treatments, and then we would send those plant parts to a lab to be analyzed. We focused on 4 primary plants. Those were persimmon, goldenrod, huckleberry, and sassafras. And we chose those 4 plants because they were common across all the fire treatments. Maybe they're not the ideal plant. Here it looks like they're actually collecting a dogwood, but this analysis I'm going to present is persimmon, huckleberry, goldenrod, and sassafras. This is none of those. This is actually greenbrier, but I have this picture here to show you that deer browsing behavior tends to focus on the tips of plants, woody plants especially, where there's new growth. White-tailed deer are called concentrate selectors, so they select the most nutritious, most easily digestible parts of plants. They don't eat the whole plant like a grazer would. So that's the parts of the plant we collected for analysis. So we collected these plants across 4 replicated treatments. So each of these treatments had multiple sites, and we collected lots of samples. We collected samples in May, June, July, August, and September, so the different months of the growing season. And then the 4 treatments were 4 burn treatments, and you can see these in the legend. It was spring, winter, summer, and then last summer. The spring burn was April, and that's actually represented by this bar off the graph I'm showing you where the fire would have occurred in April. The winter burn was February, which would have been even further to the left. The summer burn is here in June, and then the last summer would have been the previous year's June. So we have 4 burn treatments, and then we actually track the results of the lab analysis for many, many nutrients. Here I'm just presenting crude protein, which is an important nutritional value for white-tailed deer. And we can look at some results. Overall, the amount of crude protein was fairly stable across the different months that we measured it. In a sense, it sort of hovered around 11% crude protein here. But you see 2 sort of take-home or sort of obvious points or peaks in the data. And those peaks both coincide with burn treatments. So here in May, in the spring treatment, which was an April burn, you see a peak in crude protein. And then again, you see a peak in July, the month after the burn, the summer burn in June. So what we saw was that the nutritional quality of plants peaked for the first month after fire. This was consistent across a whole variety of nutrients. It wasn't always consistent, but for most nutrients, this was the pattern that we saw. You might ask why? So what's going on here? Why does the nutritional sort of plane peak the month after fire? A couple of reasons. One is the greater percentage of the plants are new growth after fire, so the plant is top killed, so everything that comes back is new growth. And I've consulted with Marcus, and we also actually saw that the new growth in recently burned plants had higher amounts of nutritional content than new growth that had not been burned. So there's not only a new growth response, but there's also a plant physiological response where they're putting more nutrition into their new growth. And this matches some other research that's looked at nutrition in response to fire treatments. So I'll shift to fruits now. So we looked at, I'm going to present fruits, both understory fleshy fruits and then overstory fruits that'll be both acorns and persimmons. But I'll first start talking about our research on understory fleshy fruits. And here we used transects, and you can see Marcus is looking for understory fleshy fruits along transects. And so we would have monitored for those fruits on both sides of the transects. And we would have recorded any fleshy fruit that we encountered, but the 3 primary fleshy fruits that we encountered in the uplands were blueberries, huckleberries, and then plants in the genus Toxicodendron there on Fort Liberty. This would be like poison oak. So I'll go through a couple of the results here with graphs. This graph actually shows a couple of important outcomes that I'll get to. But again, here on the y-axis, we have essentially fruit density along the transects. And then we have 4 treatments or 4 land cover types. We have bottomland hardwood, again, upland hardwood. And then we have the 2 season of burn treatments in our upland pines. We have dormant season upland pine burns and then growing season upland pine burns. And a couple of cool things. Each of these different land cover types is represented by different symbols on this graph. And so you can see that in different months, so we measured this, we ran these transects during 4 months during the growing season. These are the months when fleshy fruits would be most available. So June, July, August, and September. And you can see that in July, the dormant season upland pine had the most fruits, with upland hardwoods second. In August, the upland hardwoods dominated. And then in September, the upland hardwoods and bottomland hardwoods had the most fruits. And this is related to the plant species that would be most dominant in these different land cover types. And if you're looking closely, you can already guess where the majority of upland fruits were, or upland understory fruits were, if we looked at it cumulatively. The upland hardwoods, from a cumulative perspective, had twice as many understory fleshy fruits than either the dormant season or growing season upland pines or the bottomland hardwoods. So dormant season upland hardwoods are where most of the fruits are. And then the 2 burn treatments, dormant versus growing season, are pretty similar. So what's going on there? Why upland hardwoods have more fruits? So this is a photo that try to capture this sort of reasoning here. In these upland hardwood inclusions, which I'll discuss again in a second, the fuels, the understory fuels, are not as consistent. There is some wiregrass, as you can see here, but it's more patchy. There's less longleaf pine overstory or no longleaf pine overstory, so there's no longleaf pine needles to carry the fire. So here the fire tends to be patchier, and so we have unburned patches, and we may even have stems that escape fire, and they're allowed to continue to produce fruits. So what about specifically in the pines themselves, which are the dominant sort of landscape feature, and I think most of us are interested in how fire affects food and cover for animals in these upland pine systems. So if we look at time since fire in the upland pine systems, you can see here we have fruits per acre, or essentially a density of fruits on the y-axis, and then the time since fire treatments on the x-axis. And then we have the fruit availability across the different months, which is less important, but it's still a little cool. If you look at the same year as fire, which is 0, there are no fruits there. So all the plants would have been burned in these units and are top killed, and fruits would have been consumed. In the 1 year since fire, no fruits. And then all the fruits on the landscape would be in the 2+ years since fire. So if you are on a 3-year return interval, these 3 times since fire represent the majority of the landscape. Because in the 3rd year since fire, the burn would occur in the early growing season, so you'd shift back to the same year as fire. So take-home message is that on a 3-year return interval, only 1/3 of the landscape would have fruits available in the uplands. Now, that was an observational study where we just went out and measured fruits in these different time since fire treatments. We wanted a more robust experiment, so we did a controlled replicated experiment where we went out and we located replicated sites that would have received at least 4 rotations of these 3 return intervals. So we found replicated sites that had been burned on an annual return interval 4 times, had been burned on a biennial return interval 4 times, or had been burned every 3 years 4 times. And then we measured the cumulative fruits under those different return intervals. And just similar to the previous graph, it's pretty obvious what you would get. There were essentially 0 fruits in the annual return interval, and 99% less understory fleshy fruits in the 2-year return interval as compared to the 3-year return interval. So in this case, if Fort Liberty decided to shift to a 2-year return interval, the upland understory fleshy fruits would be largely extirpated. So what about mass from overstory trees? Again, Fort Liberty has this incredible access network that also serves as fire breaks and ignition sources. So primarily fires are ignited along these access roads, generally as strip fires, and they may actually be lit from multiple sides at a time. And then what you see is very close to the ignition source where this photograph is, the photographer is standing, you have low intensity fire with low flame lengths. And then as you move into the burn unit, you get higher flame lengths and more intense fire. And what we observed was a lot of the overstory hardwood trees were relegated to these areas very near the ignition source along the fire breaks. And we call this, or Marcus called this, the lifts zone, or the low intensity fire transition zone. And this was represented by the first 25 meters away from the ignition sources. And as you would have moved further in, you would have a more intense fire effects. So what we did was we went out and measured persimmons and overstory acorns across the landscape. We did this in several treatments. We looked at this in the lifts zones, which are the 25 meters next to the ignition sources in the upland pines. Again, upland hardwood inclusions, bottomland hardwoods, and then upland pines, which is UP. These would be the upland pine areas that were at least 25 meters from the ignition source, so they'd be outside the lift zone. And then open, which was largely the drop zones. And you can see here that there was no overstory persimmons or acorns in the opens because there are no trees there, so that's pretty obvious. But what's important is to look at where the peak in mean fruits per transect and mean stems per transect are. So these are numbers per transect, and on the left is the actual fruits, and on the right is the number of stems. And they're correlated. And you can see that there were very few stems or fruits in the upland pines once you got 25 meters away from the ignition source. Surprisingly few in the bottomland hardwoods. Those bottomland hardwoods they don't include persimmons and oak trees in the composition very often. And then you can see that all these fruits and stems are still available in the lift zone and the upland hardwood inclusions. But if we look at the landscape as a whole, on Fort Liberty, at least the landscape where we studied, about 17% is in these lift zones. And that's a large percentage because there's so many roads and fire breaks that a large percentage of the landscape gets relegated to the lift zone. But 80% of the fruits that were produced were in this lift zone. The proportional availability of fruits was similar in the upland hardwoods, but it only represents 2% of the landscape. So a very low percentage of the landscape, but it still contributes 8% of the overall acorn and persimmon abundance. So what we see in summary is a landscape that's obviously a fire maintained landscape. The burn units are often complete. I've been involved with, and I'm guilty of this. When you do a burn unit, the idea is to get it completely blackened. This creates a fairly homogeneous burn unit without any unburned patches. We also noted that fire intensity gets greater further away from the ignition sources, so we have less overstory hard mass there. So, going across many of these studies, some sort of consistent take-home messages are to avoid focusing homogeneously on the mean. So if the mean return interval historically would have been 3 years, work on the variance around that mean, which would include some annual burns and maybe some sites that don't get burned but every 5 years. And this variability will benefit a wide array of species, and I think would still contribute to conservation of these conservation priority plants and animals. A fire mosaic at multiple scales is important, so both within and among units. So looking for ways to increase unburned areas within burn units. I understand this can be challenging from an efficiency or logistical standpoint. Diversify firing techniques across the landscape, maybe to leave some unburned patches. And then retaining these quote-unquote fire shadows, like these upland hardwood inclusions that are less pyrophytic and may retain some fruits and flora that are unique on the landscape. And of course, this is all underlies what the landscape scale is, how much is being burned, how large are your burn units, and what's around it. So again, I'm sorry I can't be there. I'd be happy to share the presentation or any of the manuscripts that publish the science that I presented today, but otherwise I'll take questions.
Any questions for Chris? I've got a question from Kevin Robinson. Kevin, you're gonna have to speak into this, Chris can actually hear you.
It's something, but it seemed like in the one study, the first study that you showed that fruiting was increasing just a few months after burning, and staggered between the dormant season and the growing season burn. But in the next presentation, you showed that it wasn't fruiting at all within a year following burn. Were those different species, or how do you reconcile those two?
Let me look at, instead of going back on the graph. Yeah, so maybe I can go back. Maybe I'll share again.
I mean, we burn everything on a 2-year fire turn interval, and we've got plenty of blueberries and huckleberries and poison oak. So anyway.
So this graph is actually not soon after fire. These are just the months of the growing season. And so they would have been represented by different time since fire units. But on Fort Liberty, a majority of the fruits in the burn units would have been at least 2 years since fire. So hopefully that clarifies that. So this is consistent with the next graph where we see this. So so the question is relevant. So the Sandhills has less productive soils. Site indices are lower. We've always tried to sort of frame our research with the caveat that more productive soils may have more rapid response to fire in terms of fruiting, in terms of structure, and so on and so forth. So that would probably explain the difference.
All right, any other questions?
There's an online question.
So the question is there any research or data focused on mass production relative to fire in oak or oak pine dominated systems? Well, what I just presented is sort of like that. These are pine dominated systems, but I presented on sort of what happens in the oaks. I'm sure there's research otherwise, and I'm not familiar with a specific example. Maybe somebody else can discuss that. I know there's a substantial amount of work done on oak conservation related to fire in the central hardwood region.
Any other questions from the room? Not seeing any, Chris. So I want to thank you again. Thank you so much for joining us virtually. We can give Chris a round of applause, please.
Thank you.
I don't know if you can see it, Chris, but you got 250 people standing here clapping for you. So thank you so much.